All right. Hello, everybody. My name is TJ Sclafani. I'm the moderator for this panel, which is entitled Getting Started, Starting a Choral Piece from the Ground Up. This is being presented by Siadat Music Publishing and also the Siadat Creative Workshop. If you want to know more about the Creative Workshop, please take a look in the chat. I've included a link, but just a little brief sort of introduction to that. The Creative Workshop is a monthly cycle that focuses on compositional know-how and also career development for budding composers, but also composers of all ages. If you're someone who's interested in writing a piece, we have a whole list of faculty, all Siadat composers who are published, who've been composing for a long period of time. It's really a great place if you want to workshop something, but if you're someone who maybe isn't a composer, like let's say you're a conductor or a chorister, it's a great place to sort of get that out there to sort of work on your composition chops. All right, so tonight for our panel, we have two lovely panelists. We have my friend Fahad Siadat, the director and founder of Siadat Music Publishing, and Sarah Rimkus, who is a Siadat composer. You probably know her pieces Uprooted and Oh God Thy Sea. So let's get started. As I've mentioned, I mean, getting started is pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about how do you begin a piece? I mean, this is something that even composers sort of grapple with a lot. Like even for myself, I'm a composer. Sometimes I don't really know where to start. And it's sort of nice to get a sense of like how other composers start their pieces. Like where do you actually begin? So my first question for my two panelists, when you are starting to write a choral or vocal work, where do you start? Do you start at the piano? Do you start with the text? What is the first thing that happens when you're starting a choral piece? Either of you can start.
I mean, I love, I don't want to go with it depends, so I'll let Sarah jump in and say something better than it
it does
depends.
depend. So like anything in creative pursuit is probably going to depend from project to project. But for me, I would definitely say I always start with the text. I think with a vocal work, with anything with a big text or narrative or any sort of other component, if you start the music before you have that in place, that can be kind of a recipe for trouble, because then sometimes you can get yourself into a situation where you're trying to fit the music to something that it doesn't necessarily fit with. So I always start with the text. And
I have a question for you. I have a question for you about text. Sorry,
Yeah.
I've got my own question because I'm
Yeah.
curious. But like when you're like, how are you finding texts? You know, are you like, oh,
See, that's the big question, I think, because we can sit here and say like, oh, start with the text, but like, where do you even find that? I think that's one of the hardest things that we do. I think like, we have to kind of constantly be on the lookout for stuff to write pieces about and for text that we can actually use. So for me, I mean, I watch a lot of documentaries.
hmm,
I kind of look to history a lot. I look to science a lot. I look to other art forms for potential sources of inspiration. So I've done a lot of that.
hmm,
I also I'll comb through websites like Project Gutenberg, which has a lot of sort of free ebooks and like historical documents and poetry collections and stuff like that are all public domain that you can access online.
hmm.
And so I just kind of have to kind of keep my ear to the ground all the time for different topics. And I have certain websites that I tend to look to when I'm looking for something. I don't know, where do you find your text?
Honestly, like I think I mean I wish I was like inspired to go out and like do research, and I think there was a time when I would do things like that, but so much of like ever since I started writing more choral music that doesn't have text, I find I only write music with text if I catch a text that like strikes me
Yeah,
as
that makes
musical,
sense.
you know. And so like sometimes it comes in really funny ways. Like actually I wanted to I pulled this up. I wanted to show I'm gonna share my screen for a second
Oh, sure.
because this is so I'll tell you, I was in a rehearsal, a choir rehearsal, and we were broke up. We were rehearsing in a church, like in their like meeting room area, not like in the sanctuary. And so we broke up into sectionals, and where I was going for my part of the sectionals was like in their separate kind of sitting meeting room. And there was not a whiteboard, but I don't know what you call it, like one of those flipboard kind of things, like with the butcher paper. And there was the notes left over from a class, and it was one of those instances where I saw it and I just took a picture of it because I was like, this feels like music to me. So I'm going to share what it was. So these were the notes that I saw. And I was like, this is perfect. It's got a title, the analogy of being, and I don't know what it was, but there was something about this text that just struck me as so, I don't know. I heard music, and so this was like, this was a recent piece that I knew I wanted to work on. And then when I received a commission, I remember the commissioner, these were the other pages of it. Let's see if I can find them. This was the other one. It was 3 pages. So I was like, great, 3 movements. Perfect. And then this was the 3rd one.
Nice.
Sort of whiteboard text. Yeah. And so I think what I do is similar to what you're saying, Sarah, like I collect.
Yeah.
Like I'll find and I don't, I'm like, this strikes me as musical. And so I'll hold on to it. And then when someone was like, oh, we'd love to have you like work on a piece for our group. I remember there was this group in Oklahoma, and they said, the director was like, yeah, there's just like all this cowboy poetry that I'm really into, and I just think it would make really good choral music. And so he sent me a bunch of it, and I was like, that's really cool. I think you should write that piece. And then I sent him those pictures, and I said, this is the text I want to set.
Yeah.
And he was like, okay, cool, you're the artist. That's cool. But it ended up being like, I think when I start from a text that really just strikes me, like, so for me, I don't know, I'm more like, I feel like more like John Cage or Duchamp in that way. It's like found art,
Yeah, I know I definitely have those experiences from time to time also. I mean, the Oh God Thy See piece, that definitely, like, that felt a lot like a found text to me, because I just ran across that line like in the West Wing.
Yeah, it's so musical. It's immediately.
Yeah, and I knew that I wanted to write something. It was one of those ones where I knew immediately, like, kind of the overall thing that I wanted to go for, that I wanted to write something super stretched out and textural like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a question of like, what do you do when somebody approaches you and you don't have anything in the collection?
Right. Right.
So, like, sometimes, sometimes I think I still end up having to do some research, but
totally. It's funny because I love poetry, like, I mean, I grew up reading a lot of Sufi poetry and Whitman, and I've got all my Robert Frost, and I purchased, like, I got these books because I was like, I'm going to mine them for choral music. But a lot of times I have a hard time setting them to music because I don't think they need anything. Like my favorite poems are good by themselves.
Yeah, like there are some poems that set well and some that don't, and also some that just should be left alone. Like, sometimes it's easier to work with poetry that is not necessarily like your favorite poem ever of all time, because you want to be able to bring something to the table.
Right.
And
well, that's what I love about what you were saying about like the Oh God Thy See text, right? Because it has such a clear, like, it has such a big feeling to it, and I love that you're like, there's like, I can see how you would see that and be like, I want to bring that feeling to the forefront, with the music.
Yeah. Well, I think that I'm also like, I'm often attracted to like much shorter texts like that, because you can do more with them texturally. Like, I think a lot of what we talk about in sort of like composition degree programs, like when you're learning to compose in an academic setting and we're talking about vocal music, so much of what you learn about is how to set the text such that it mirrors the natural speech patterns and it's intelligible. And that's all very important. But I mean, with choral music especially, like, you can do everything right. Like, you can set the text in a really straightforward way. You can do this, you can do that to make sure that we're going to understand the words.
Right.
And you can get into a concert acoustic and still not understand a word,
Right.
even when you've done everything right. Like,
Totally.
so I like texts where I can like repeat a fair amount, because then I can do things that are more interesting texturally and in service to the message or the overall feeling of the text. But if every single word isn't intelligible 100% of the time, we're still going to get the meaning of it, because
Right.
it repeats enough that we can absorb it.
So I actually have a follow-up question now that we're getting sort of to intelligibility in text. What is your process then for wordless pieces? I mean, Fahad,
Hmm.
we know that you've written some wordless pieces, such as the Vast Sea. Sarah, I'm not sure if you've done wordless pieces,
That's a good question. I'm
but
sure
where
I
do you
have.
start when the text doesn't really matter?
Right. Well, I think, I mean, for me, that plays with that goes off of what Sarah was just saying, right? I mean, like one of the freedoms of working with a shorter text is it gives you musical freedom to play within it and to explore like the idea behind this text from those different facets in a musical way, right? And so I totally agree. Like I either want a whole page of tightly spaced text, right? That that like it's that for me that gives like a similar sort of musical freedom, or yeah, I want like a line to play with or no words at all. So because I think for me a lot of it will then come down to, and this is true I think as part of my TJ, you were asking earlier, like do we start at the piano, do we that kind of stuff. For me it starts with the physicality of singing. Like as a singer myself, right, I'm looking at my own approach to the voice and musical textures or ideas that are coming out just in my own performance practice, right? And then from there, yeah, a lot of it comes from singing those words in different ways and exploring like the physicality of the words themselves, and then with what we were kind of saying before, looking at the underlying emotional subtext, right? So this is what it's literally saying, which I agree, Sarah. That's like step one, right? And that's what we're taught, and make sure the scansion is right and all that other kind of stuff. But
Yeah,
then it's like,
exactly.
but what's between the lines, and like what's the subtext? And for me, it's like about like if I detect a subtext that isn't super obvious, that's what I want to bring forward in the music, right?
Yeah, I think that for there to be like a true like marriage of words and text, like kind of the whole has to be greater than the sum of the parts.
Totally, I love that. I love that.
Like there has to be that sort of 1 + 1 = 3 effect of the music and uh, words working together in a way that is oftentimes kind of like intangible. But I think that that has to be there to go beyond the sort of details of the text setting.
That's great.
Um,
Do you
or,
know that piece? Do you know that piece by Michael Delira, the Campers at Kitty Hawk? It's part of his like 3 USA stories. It's kind of it's similar to what you're talking about. Is it's also like a whole page of text, but it's very narrative, right? It reads like a news story, but the whole thing is what you're saying is like there's that subtext that he like it's about the Campers at Kitty Hawk is specifically about the Wright brothers and the first flight, and the way that he does it is like the voices almost sound like a Morse code telegraph,
sounds right
and
up my alley.
it's so cool. It's a really cool piece. C4 recorded it on their second album, as you can find it on Spotify or whatever. But it does exactly what you're saying. Is that something new is created, right? By creating that subtext, you get put into the place of the story. You're not just being told the story. You're living it in a different way. And I love that idea of text setting, not just being like, and then we went up the hill, and then we went down the hill, right? Which is so
Yeah,
literal, but like text setting the vibe, or text setting the story underneath the story. And I think the texts that jump out at me are the ones that clearly have that sort of deep energy underneath it, something that I want to pick apart and choose one facet of and bring that part to life with the music.
I think, sorry, to answer your question, I think for me, if text is no consideration, or if like I'm writing an instrumental piece, or I've sort of absorbed the text already, for me, the next thing that I kind of turn to start a piece or plan a piece, I start with harmony. Like, um, I don't know why. I mean, I think that's just kind of what I tend to think about first in terms of structuring a piece and in terms of the overall sounds of things that I want. That's just kind of what I go to first.
Like you
Um,
find like sweet chord progression kind of things, or
yeah, chord progressions, and I tried to kind of scan in a couple to show you if you want to see
Sure, of
what
course.
that looks like. Um, but this is I have a piece that I wrote last year that is kind of a cool example of some of these things that we're talking about. I wrote this piece for the Glasgow School of Art choir, and it's about 10 or 11 minutes, and I took the text from the writings of a late 1600s, early 1700s naturalist named Maria Sibylla Merian, who was one of the first um, entomologists. Like, she was the first female entomologist that we have kind of a record of and know a lot about. So she wrote about bugs. And she also did these like gorgeous Technicolor illustrations of these insects that she studied, and she studied their metamorphosis processes in particular. So I managed to get a hold of an English translation of her book
where is
that
she
she,
from?
the Germany, Netherlands
Germany.
area. She
Okay.
spoke Dutch, so her writing is all in Dutch. So they had to like, the choir was very nice, and they ordered me this book that had the only English translation that I could find, and I got permission and everything. And so it took some excerpts from this book all about bugs and their like metamorphosis processes. So it's a lot of like text,
Okay.
and kind of narrative, but I kind of decided that it was going to be divided up into pretty short movements, and I was just going to organize it around intervals.
Hmm.
So and starting small and getting larger and larger and larger. So the first movement kind of focused on like the sort of major second, minor third, um, and then it kind of expanded outward from there until the last movement, which had a kind of a major sixth relationship between sort of the two main areas. But let's see, is that the one? This one. But this is just an example of
Oh
like
wow.
what I tend to do. I tried to like the pages that I use are pretty big, so the scanner app didn't like it very much. But like, this is the lines of text that I was using for this particular movement, which is about a jasmine tree, and the caterpillar that lives on it. So I just kind of like use sort of stemless note heads, um, and I kind of use like uh, unfilled ones for stuff that's going to be sustaining, and filled in ones for stuff that's going to move. And I don't know why, but brackets tend to be stuff that's repeating. And I just kind of, after I've kind of taken on board the text and had some time to consider it, just kind of like map out the harmonies.
Hmm.
Um, and off like I consider texture as well, and like any melodies that I know that I want to have. And sometimes I'll even like, I kind of numbered all the lines and mapped it out by line, which line was going to have, where that all was going to fall. So that's kind of my sort of very methodical process that I've kind of developed over the years, but that gives you some idea of what I tend to do.
I love the big staff paper. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, it's Faber A3. Um, I used to get the really big stuff from Valley Music out in North Hollywood. That stuff's pretty pricey though,
Hmm.
so now
Yeah.
I just order the tabloid size.
When I had
I
access
write a
to
lot
a
by hand.
when I had access to a great school printer, I used to print out my own 11 by 17 staff paper, just double
Nice.
sided on there, and be like, it's fine. I'm just
Yeah.
gonna print it out myself.
Nothing to
Um,
see here.
so this is actually a good segue because you, Sarah, you mentioned like this is a process that has taken years as a composer. I just kind of wanted to know from both of you, do you, I mean, of course, this is going to like need some memory and some recall here, but over the course of your compositional career, how has your process changed? Like in terms of starting a piece, like I want you to remember the first time you started writing, like how is that different from today?
Hmm, that's interesting. You know,
It's hard to remember.
I know, I
I,
know.
I definitely, and I still do, you know, similar to what Sarah was saying, like I still do, but I definitely used to focus more on harmony than I think than anything else. But always from the very beginning, the first thing I would usually do is just like improvisation has always been a part of my compositional practice. And so I think singing through the lines and just seeing what, you know, like what it feels like, what the melody, just how it occurs to me. And sometimes, like, you know, some of my more homophonic pieces just start off like that, like, oh, I found a good melody that I like, and then I'm going to harmonize it and then create some polyphonic textures from here and there. Like an older piece of mine, Out of the Rolling Ocean, was like that. Like I loved the text and I would just sing it and then I harmonized it, and that was the whole thing. And sometimes when that happens, it goes the quickest. Those tend to be the simplest pieces. Um, but I think more and more I don't know, like my concepts around the things that I want to explore in music have changed. Like it used to be very much like melody and the harmony, and now I think a lot more about like texture, like what Sarah was saying, you know. And I think not just about melody and harmony, but yeah, texture and timbre, and again, for me, it's very much about the physicality of the sound itself. Oh, and even if I'm writing something for instruments or on piano, like I'm no concert pianist, but I play it. You know, I try to play through and sing things to see how they really feel and how they sound on an acoustic instrument. You know, before I give up the notes to like a MIDI playback, in which case everything sounds terrible.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, I think I mean it's I think it's funny to talk about like how I always start with harmony. I'm even a little bit hesitant to say that now because like I think that I really admire your focus on the vocals more so. Like I think if anything in sort of composition education, like if anything we emphasize harmony, like that's we don't always have to start there. And um, but I think the main ways that how my process has changed. I think I've always been kind of a planner and like to be fairly organized and sketch sketch things out and plan pieces. That's a big part of it. But I think the biggest change has just been over time. I've tended to stick to my plans more and more.
Hmm.
Um, I, I, I remember outlining all of my pieces quite extensively, like in undergrad as a composition student, and it was always very helpful. Like it's always helpful to it's always been helpful for me, but I would never actually stick to it. Um,
Yeah.
and it was always a question of like paring down. Like I would plan way too much stuff for one piece and then end up
Hmm.
paring it back and paring it back. And that's still something that I do some of. Like more often am I deleting during the editing process
Hmm.
than adding.
Yeah, I do.
I also yeah, I used to
Okay.
work at the piano a lot more. I definitely sketch at the piano, but try to take myself away from it when I'm done sketching, because otherwise I'll just be like, oh, I can add this cool chord here and that cool chord there. But like sometimes you don't need every single harmonic possibility in every piece because it's just not
Totally.
necessary.
Totally.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I love that. I love that. No, I definitely, I mean, I definitely use harmony a lot. Like I find I'm happiest when I combine, you know, like for instance, if I'm like, okay, here's a harmonic language that I want to use, and then within that, like maybe I'm using that as a
Mm-hmm.
tool for improvising, or one of the biggest changes is that I've gotten comfortable with recording over the last 5 years or so, in particular. And so I've been using recording and like multi-tracking and layering as a way to emphasize or to continue growing the process. And when I first started doing that, a little maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, it was really chaotic. Like I would just sing something and then I would try to harmonize with it, and I never knew what I was doing. I don't have that kind of great improvisatory harmonizing ear, you know. And then I would go back to the harmony, and I had some really successful pieces come from saying, okay, here's my chord progression. Now let me lay down a bass. And then from there, by the act of like there's this one tune that TJ, you actually performed, that was part of a chamber opera that I did. That was a resetting of the Pierrot Lunaire text, and and as I was laying down the things, and I was like, okay, how am I sort of want to a cappella this, right? So one of the lines was like, bow, wow, 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 right? And so I was like, okay, cool, I'm doing that. But then as I was doing it, because I was physically doing it, I started changing the sound of it. And I realized that like this was a big realization for me when I was writing this piece in particular, because I would never have made those changes if I was only doing it on paper, or if I was only doing it on the piano, because the piano's timbre doesn't change, right? But as I was singing through this, I was going bow wow 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 wow, and I was like, oh, I like that. And then when I started, so I recorded that line, and now I'm going to do the tenor, and I did it a fifth higher to get the fifth of the chord. And then as I started doing that, I was doing it homophonically. And at one point I just turned it around, right? So instead of going bow, wow, 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 and I just turned, the rhythm was the same, but the vowels were different. And again, like it hit me that I would have only made that choice if I had actually physically sung those things and multi-tracked them. Because if it was on paper, it would have just been like, great, copy, paste, put that up there. Now it's at the fifth, or on the piano. Again, the timbre doesn't change. The piano doesn't care what vowels I'm singing. And that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And that's when I started getting really into texture in a whole new way, was when I started realizing, oh, if I sing through every line and I really like pay attention to the acoustics of the voice, and I combine that with this more traditional training and like harmony and form and things like that, then I built out the whole accompaniment, and then I had this really rockin' set of textures and chord progressions, and then I improvised a solo over it, right? Transcribed the whole thing, fixed it on the paper, re-recorded it again, make sure, and going back and forth like that has become a more successful part of my process. So like using that formal theoretical approach and training, and then combining that with a more physical and performative approach, and then going back, right, putting it on paper, making sure it doesn't suck, and then singing it again and making sure it actually still doesn't suck, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been finding a lot of happiness. It
That's
takes a
awesome.
long time, but I like it. Like it seems to be coming up with things that I've been enjoying more. So
Yeah,
Cool. All right.
that's awesome.
I'll jump into the next question I have here. So I want you to think of a time when you started a choral piece and you had everything down and you were ready to go, but it went in a completely different direction. Do you have a piece like that? And what made you change the direction for that piece?
I can't, in recent memory, I can't think of a piece that completely and totally changed direction. Just because um, I like to try to give myself plenty of time with the text in my mind before I actually like put pen to paper. So ideally, like I've had enough time to think about it, so I have I have a solid enough idea of what I want, that there certainly can be some changes, but I can't think of an instance sort of in recent years where it's completely taken a total left turn. But I did write a piece last, was it 2 months ago, a month ago, that I found this text that is a stunning poem, and it was about Arctic terns and their migration. And the conductor that I was working with happens to really love bird watching, so like it was a very nice fit. But yeah, see this, you got to be like on the lookout for these connections. Like you never know where you're going to get your ideas from. Um, but I had this poem that I, of course, then really ended up struggling with quite a lot because it's a beautiful poem and I don't want to ruin it. And I want to do it justice. And I want us to be able to actually understand the words. So there are opportunities, but also challenges there, to be sure. So this is this poem that I was setting. And I sort of was messing around with it and sort of came up with this a bit of an ostinato that I liked for the overall feel of it and wanted to use, that kind of sounded like, you know, the, oh, I thought I had my keyboard on, but apparently I don't. That was just like, was kind of like that with the widening intervals. Um, and I sort of figured out all these different permutations of it and like doing it in parallel fifths and parallel fourths and kind of all these harmonic possibilities generated from this line. Um, and I started the piece having that in there from the very beginning. And that was my idea, that I would kind of start with that and build up from there. But it was just not working. I think it moved too much from the very beginning. So I couldn't have that level of movement and that level of implied harmonic change and still work with all the text. Like there was just no way for those things to come together.
Okay.
So I ended
Cool.
up saving it for like actually the climax of the piece. And leading up to that, I like stretched it out like really, really like just with a bunch of sustained notes and gave the text to soloists that were just kind of like pattering it out in a more urgent kind of way, because I felt that that was kind of what the really declarative text needed. So just kind of, I guess that wasn't like a total rejigging of the entire thing, but sort of turned the structure of it, what I was imagining, completely inside out to make sure it was going to work with the text.
Cool.
Cool.
I think I'm in the middle of what you're talking about right now, actually, TJ, with a piece that I'm working on for a group, and it's a poem by. Actually, I think he's in Minnesota now, but he was an LA composer or poet, Doug Kearney, and I'll show you the poem. It's a really cool. He does these really interesting, like typographic poems, as well as, I mean, and the way he performs them are just completely. Well, anyway, so when I saw this poem and I loved it, and what for me, I heard texture right away, right? I heard this like almost Joker-ish, you know, multi-metric, just lots of voices polyphonically creating this chaos. And I was like, great, love this piece. I hear music, and I didn't even look at the rest of the words, right? There's all these words that are underneath the he's, and so I had this plan, and I started sketching out like these like overall textures, and then I started reading the poem, and I was like, I have no idea what this poem is about. And then I started looking at what the poem was about, and learning this whole backstory, right? And then and it's, the whole thing is about the curse of Ham, which is one like so Doug Kearney writes, he's sort of in between the avant-garde world of poetry and the hip-hop world of poetry, and he's also very performative. Like he performs his own poems in a very particular way, and I knew that, so I didn't look at how he performed this piece, which was the kind of the third change. But when I started learning about the story about Noah and Ham, and the whole thing is that like Ham Ham, I think it was, my biblical history not so strong, saw his father Noah naked at one point, and apparently in biblical times that was a major no-no, and so Noah curses him, and his son receives the curse. And some people believe that that is where black people come from, is that he cursed him to have dark skin. And so, and Doug Kearney, who is a black poet, wanted to pull that sort of mythology around where blackness comes from and blackness being a curse. He wanted to pull that apart and look, and that's what that poem is about. And I did not know that. I just saw this really cool texture, and I was like, "Yeah, music," you know. And so, you know, so I'm keeping some of that texture, but it really changed my view of the piece. And then when there's a recording online of Doug performing this piece, and the way that he recited it was, his interpretation of the he's were so different. I'll just to show you again.
Sure.
Something kind of interesting. So what I saw was he, and what he did was, two fathers are two sons, and one he father prone, and where he's been he, and I was like, oh, I don't know if he's gonna like this.
Yeah.
You know, and because he's got that sort of musical approach, I've been like, oh, I have to think about this differently. So now what I'm doing is like, understanding those things have informed how I'm approaching the piece differently. So I still have moments of those textures, but then there's like slower moments where the he's are more like how he performed them. And now I'm also letting the actual story inform the piece. And also we did like a 2-minute workshop of sketches of the piece. And after workshopping it for like 30 minutes of the choirs going he, they were like, we can't do that for the duration of the piece. We're clear, right? That's like not okay. And I was like, okay, yeah. So that was the third thing, was like, again, making it physical. I realized that wasn't like a sustainable performance approach or technique for like, because the piece is supposed to be like 6 to 8 minutes. So yeah, so now I'm in a place after that workshop where I'm in the middle of rethinking a lot of this piece, but I think it's for good reason. You know, like there's real things that are informing these choices, and it's because the piece suddenly has more depth, right? Than my initial, like I had one initial textural idea that wasn't going to hold the ear or the voice for 6 minutes, and now I'm understanding more the story and the poet's approach and all these things. And now it's actually feeling more like a real collaboration between me and the poet, even though we're not chatting about it regularly.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. I have one last question before we go on to our Q&A session with our audience members' questions. Just really quickly, what advice do you have for new composers on beginning a choral piece? Just keep your answers brief. I know there's a lot there, but try to put your professor's hat on and just be like,
I mean, I always say just stay curious. Like, stay curious about the world. Be open to ideas. You never know when you're going to have that moment where you come across a text or even just a few words somewhere that's going to speak to you. So just stay open to the ideas that the universe will present you with if you let it.
I
And
love
sing
that.
through
I
all your
love that.
parts.
Sing through all your parts. Damn right.
Sing through all your parts.
No, I love stay curious. I'm gonna keep that one in my back pocket and share it with my students. I love that. I had a revelation this morning that I'll share as my bit of advice, which is you know how like they say Hemingway wrote 500 words a day.
something like
So
that.
yeah, so he's like, he just did that every day, and then he probably drank himself into a stupor. And you know, if you write 500 words a day, then you've written 730 pages by the end of the year. You can cut half of them, and you have a good novel, right? Or you cut none of them, and you have 2 novels. Who knows? And so I had the thought of like, what is the musical equivalent of that, right? Like, would it be measures instead of pages, right? Well, how many is 730 measures? And I looked, and the oratorio that I'm working on, I just completed my first draft, and it was almost exactly 730 measures. And it's taken me a year and a half to write it. And I thought, if I had just written 2 measures a day, I would have done it. I would have gotten it done way faster. So my advice to people is write 2 measures a day.
Okay.
I mean, it seems like such a reasonable ask, but I realized that if I actually wrote like 2, maybe 4 measures a day, and I did it every single day, I would be so prolific. And it just occurred to me that like that's such a small it's such a small goal. And so for the
Yeah.
last couple of weeks I've been writing 2 measures a day and I'm just banging music out. It's awesome. Sometimes I get inspired and I write like 4 or 5 measures.
Ooh.
But I let that be enough.
Yeah.
I'm just like, but I think the showing up every day, like if inspiration is going to strike, I better show up in case it does. You know what I mean? If I
Mm.
don't show up and inspiration strikes, well, that's it. It has no chance. But if I show up even for 2 measures and inspiration shows up too, then maybe I'll get 8 measures or 16 or a whole damn piece. Who knows?
Well,
So
and
that's
I think doing it, like being there and doing it every day, like you have to practice composition, like you have to practice an instrument. I think sometimes people don't quite realize that because it's like an on paper um, kind of pursuit as opposed to a physical pursuit. But I mean, it's the same thing, really. Like it just takes practice. And I
totally.
think it's funny because 2 measures a day, that makes total sense. But I think at the same time, it also helps to remember that like the creative process isn't always linear. Like you're gonna have good days and you're gonna have bad days, and inspiration or motivation comes and goes for anything that we do. So like if you have a really great composing day one day and a not so good composing day the next day, like that's also totally normal and fine. But it's still good to show up for it every day.
I think so. Yeah, I found that the 2 measures, like sometimes it takes me half an hour just to get to the 2 measures after I've played and sung through and
Yeah.
and I realize I'm making all these great corrections and changes and then I'm like, okay, now my 2 measures. But the thing that I love about this is it's actually it's what you were saying, Sarah. It's renewed my curiosity about my own music. As I'm playing through stuff, I'm like I'm being slow about it and I'm taking the time
Mm-hmm.
and I'm loving the piece as it develops, which is really nice. I'm working on an art song right now. Also, don't work on more than one piece at a time. I break this rule all the time. I'm
Yeah.
working on 3 pieces and it's driving me nuts. But when I'm only working
Three is
on
too
one,
many.
it's too many. It's too many. And so,
So
but I've
see, I think
consciously put the other
sometimes
ones aside
sometimes two can be okay.
if they're
Because
if
you
they're
can
very
if
different.
if they're very different, if you get burnt out on one, you can work on the other.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
But it just kind of depends on like, see, I just try to be really conscious about spacing my deadlines out,
Mhm.
so that, if I'm sort of mulling one piece over in the back of my mind and actively writing like pencil to paper another, like that sort of allows me to keep things on an even keel,
Totally. I,
and not get too burnt out on any one thing.
totally.
Oh,
I've also found real joy, and I think this is something that I've been recommending to my students more. I've been finding real joy in writing without a purpose, like without a piece in mind, and just showing up and improvising for a while and then notating like my favorite 8 bars of something that I just improvised and then leaving it. And I'm really happy to have like books of sketches that are just sketches that I can go back to when the well has run dry or if I'm not feeling motivated. But this, as you were saying, it's like practice. I'm not like finishing a whole
Mm-hmm.
piece. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
practicing 4 to 8 measures at a time just to write something.
Mm-hmm.
great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would like just to move on to our audience questions. We have a question from Lee. Lee asks, do either of you have a structure for a piece in mind or a musical idea that you want to try out before you begin? So before beginning a piece.
What do you like just in general, like, oh, do I have like a form in mind that I really want, like a structure that drives the piece, or I'm not sure if I understand the question.
And what I think I was getting at was when you look at the text, you somehow have to have some sort of structure in mind for the
Mm,
piece when you start. So otherwise, you don't know where you're going, or you don't have an overriding idea of how something is organized. So that was, or whether you had some sort of musical thought. I mean, you tend to like to do a lot of things that don't have words. So you make sounds. That's a musical idea. So, I mean, that would be another way to look at this. Do you have a musical idea that you want to bring to this piece ahead of time? Once you've looked at the text, so it's not that it's inappropriate, but
right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I do look at the.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does change. It depends on the text, of course. But sometimes I do see a text and I'm like, rounded binary. That's going to be AABA for sure, you know. And it just appears like that. I think that's great. Sometimes I do have motivic material that I want that I put on text, for sure.
In terms of like, in terms of the form of a piece, like the overall structure of like what form is a funny one for me. Like I don't know, I've never felt like, you know, being super specific and structured in how I approach form. I've never felt like that's my strong suit. I don't know, like I think that's something that like I could stand to learn more about. And probably that's because, I mean, when you have a text, the text is going to help give you the form of the piece, and it's going to give you an impetus for organizing things.
For sure.
And of course, like, I mean, I also do really enjoy writing instrumental music, and it's been a long since a goal of mine to do that more often. It's just that, you know, I get all these commissions for choir pieces, which is wonderful. But there's sort of more opportunity there. So that takes up most of my calendar. But I mean, I love writing for instruments as well. But then, of course, you have to organize the music from scratch. So then that forces me to think a little bit more about form and structure, if that's what you're interested in. But with a text, the text is often, especially if it's in any sort of specific, like if you've got stanzas, if you've got any sort of like rhyming or repetition scheme, if you've got any of that, like that implies form in the music.
Great. Cool. All right. We have two more questions coming in. So we have a question from Andrew. Andrew asks, tell us about the most unique use of an instrument you have composed for. I kind of want to modify that question a little bit since this is choral music. I guess tell us about the most unique use of the voice that you've composed for. Well,
Fahad, that's probably like your specialty.
Well,
you do so many cool things with the voice.
I actually want to answer the instrument version first, because I definitely wrote a piece for whirlies at one point. You know, the little tubes that I was getting really into overtones, and I was like, oh my gosh, you can spin a tube and it makes overtones. And I put it in
that's so cool.
in a opera that I was writing. There was a part where like half of the instrumentalists just started like swinging whirlies, and it's really cool.
That's awesome. See, I came across this cellist like last night. Somehow came across my news feed. And what's his name? Like Rashad Egerton or something, and he plays cello and he like ties a kazoo to his cello and like plays kazoo at the same time as he plays cello, and it's amazing. And now I like the harmonics work so well together, and
That's
now
awesome.
I want to write for cello and kazoo, but I haven't yet.
That's nice. Yeah.
I mean, I wish that you know, I would love to do more of that. Like sourcing more interesting instruments and stuff like that.
Is it possible for him to keep two musical ideas going simultaneously?
Oh yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah.
Like he's clearly like very silly and very funny, but very talented and very skilled.
But yeah, to answer Andrew's question about the voice, I think particularly, I think, you know, part of the joy of being a person that is like a performer composer, and I don't mean that as like a double major of like I perform and I compose, but a person who's like sort of a singer songwriter but for classical music, is that because I write a lot for myself to perform, and this is maybe outside of less outside of choral music because I can't perform choral music alone. But for my solo stuff, I'm like the things that are possible with the voice when I don't have to worry about notating the instructions for somebody else, right? Just the way that like as a guitar player, I figure out my sound and my distortion and my setup. I don't have to worry about telling anyone else how to do it. I just make the sound that I want. That's my sound, and it creates a lot of really great and sort of wild opportunities for the voice. Where I can, and you can just kind of go into all kinds of stuff, and I don't ever have to worry about like what it looks like on the page or someone else doing it, right? Because it's just what I do.
Yeah, that's a big consideration, is like, how do you communicate this to a performer that you're not necessarily directly interacting with?
Totally.
I think the ways that the ways that I have explored using specific timbres and sounds in the voice, I think honestly, like I've sort of in recent years discovered the power of just using different vowels, which is such a simple thing, but different vowels and different shapes in your mouth, they're gonna have different overtones present in the sound. So an E vowel has a lot more high overtones that naturally exist from the sound waves interacting with each other than a closed oo vowel. And the amount of difference that simple change can make in a vocal piece, that can really make a huge difference. So that's a much more much tamer, more straightforward application of that. But in terms
but
of
I love
thinking
that.
about the sound for the voice, that's
It's huge.
something that
It's
I've thought a
huge.
lot about. Yeah.
That's
And that's
totally
also
huge.
something that we don't really talk about so much. Like
That is dealing with the physicality of the voice. I mean, what you're
yeah,
talking about
yeah,
is such a core
absolutely.
part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We
I've
talk
also
about this a lot in the Neo Festival, which is like the festival that I help run in the summers. But a lot of it is just what you're saying, like consider vowel as a creative choice. Like every vowel is its
yeah,
own
absolutely.
timbre. It's such a great idea. And it's so accessible. Like, no one, you don't have to worry about making weird noises. It's just E, O, U, start there. It's cool.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I think we have time for two more questions. Can we do two more questions,
Yeah,
everybody?
there are a couple more in the chat, right?
Yeah, I'm not in a hurry.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question from Aethon. This is just a general question. Can you comment on the state of the industry in terms of which stylistic and musical trends you're seeing in choral music right now? Maybe
Well,
keep this answer a little brief.
I saw a post like this on one of those Facebook groups the other day. I don't actually like. I try not to fixate too much on the choral music Facebook groups because there's a lot that goes on in there. But occasionally, like one of my friends will comment, like a Facebook friend will comment on something, and it'll show up in my feed. And and this is not the first time I've seen this, but I've seen a lot of people really sort of bemoaning the lack of counterpoint in vocal music. And that was very interesting to me because counterpoint, counterpoint referring to, the relationship of one voice to another, in particular in more like polyphonic textures. So like multiple independent lines of vocal music. And that's something that I think a lot about. That's something that I work really hard at a lot of the time and really enjoy creating a lot of great contrapuntal textures. And I mean, I don't think I'm alone in that either. Like I know a lot of other composers and did grad school with other composers who are also really interested in that. And it's not the first time I've seen somebody talk about how, oh, nobody writes counterpoint anymore. So it's just kind of interesting to me because I always see people saying that doesn't exist when really that does exist. It's just maybe there's some sort of disconnect of they're just not seeing it for some reason. But I don't know. I think um, maybe uh, maybe we'll be seeing even more of that in coming years. I don't know. Um, I don't know.
It's
There's so
interesting.
much. People are so different. There's so much divergent things going on right now. It's tough to say.
I think that's a great point, which is that, you know, it depends. Like when you're talking about what pieces are getting traction, it depends on which aspect of the
Which
choral world you're
subset of the
talking
choral
about.
universe?
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
yeah.
Because there's a lot of it that's just like, oh, we're really into, you know, sort of pop adjacent things, and those things do tend to be more homophonic, and they tend to be popular among younger singers, right? And then there's like the you know, the world of like chamber choirs and professional choirs that tend to embrace more of the polyphonic stuff, you know, and other kinds of like aleatoric textures and things like that. You know, across the, I think it's a question of like what is relevant to people's ears and to their minds, right? So in terms of the musical ideas, yeah, like for some singers, it's going to be those homophonic textures feel the most accessible and relevant. For other people who are well versed in classical and new music, it's going to be the polyphonic stuff. And honestly, for right now in the 21st century, like in the last year especially, like things that are about social issues have been, you know, they feel the most relevant to people right now. So I think it's a moving target,
for sure.
you know, that's about musical, like the musical idioms that feel relevant and that provide a touch point, and also like the philosophical or the text ideas that also feel relevant. I also think alongside that that interest in the social, like in social issues, there's also like a rising interest in spiritual questions, you know, that I've been seeing a lot of more in like the new music and the professional choir world. But there's a lot of I'm seeing more and more pieces that are very meditative and are actually, Sarah, similar to the pieces that you're talking about, or a lot of them are about nature. Like a lot of people are hungry for, people who are living in cities are missing a connection with nature and are looking for it in their artistic experience. So, you know,
I also wonder, I feel like we're gonna have a very large collection of aleatoric pieces written right now. And I don't know if that's gonna mean like pieces that don't need to be performed in rhythmic time. Like I don't know if that means that we're going to see a lot of that in the coming years, or if we're like all going to be sick of it when we can actually sing together, and we won't see that for a while. Maybe the lines and boxes will fall out of fashion a little bit. I don't know, but who knows?
All right. Last question, and then we're gonna sign off. This is actually a really good question from Stephen. Stephen asks, do you have any advice for starting composing later in life after working for years in another art form?
yeah, I mean, embrace your other art form.
Yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
like, I mean, I don't mean like don't make music, right? But I mean that there is so much amazing, um, there are so many like unique ideas that come from applying one mode of thinking in one medium to a different mode of thinking. You know, like what if what minimalism means in music, for instance, was applied to dance, which is not, it's the exact opposite, right? Minimalism in dance is like very little movement. But what if it was repeating motifs over and over again? You know, what if this was minimalism in dance? I mean, I'm not a dancer, right? But I think that there's a lot of really interesting cross contamination that happens. I know a pianist. This is not between different disciplines, but I know a pianist who was studying tabla and realized that he could create new piano techniques by applying how you play the tabla to the piano, right? And I think that there's all of these like structural ideas that come from visual art or from dance or from literature or whatever, you know, that that can make their way into your musical ideas to great fruition. So that's what I would suggest. I have a little bit of a movement background, not in dance, but in like doing martial arts and some other things, and that stuff makes its way into. I mean, my interest in the physicality of sound comes from a background of doing things that were very physical, right? And getting involved in my body in that way. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think we should always embrace our other interests, like our other interests and the other parts of our lives, like always can inform our music and
Totally.
stuff.
Yeah, I was saying before we got started that my first real love is books. And I think it's no surprise that I am predominantly interested in writing narrative driven pieces that use text, that I really want to like write more operas, right? I mean, like, why not? I want to tell musical stories, and I want to take music stories that I love and I want to bring them to life in different ways. And that doesn't come from just being like music all the time, music, 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 you know?
Yeah.
So,
Great.
I recently I bought like this little gel plate for printmaking. Like I also like I love visual art also. I don't have like a terrible amount of aptitude for it, but because I don't have enough spatial skills. But you know, I enjoy color and line and texture and pattern and all these things. And I really enjoy printmaking. Like I just find it a really cool art form. So I got this sort of little beginner plate to do printmaking with. And I think that one of the things that attracts me about that medium is the ability to layer, like the importance of layering. And I think also in my music, I really tend to think about building my harmonies and textures and dealing with structuring all these things in terms of layering and putting one thing on top of another and seeing what happens. So everything we do can inform what we do in our music, and we can always embrace what we can learn from
totally.
other aspects of our lives.
Yeah, I have a friend who's really into sewing, and she started creating puppets. She was like, "Oh, I'm going to make puppets," and then she started making puppet. And she's a fabulous singer, and she started making puppet music videos. And now she's like, "I'm going to write a puppet opera," and it's like, you know,
That sounds
and
awesome.
it's like totally amazing. Like her music videos are there's you can YouTube one called "Control Z Your Life." And it's about wanting to hit undo on your life, and it's just this puppet going. It's great. Control Z your life. It's wonderful. But then, like, this same performer is doing a solo opera of some like experimental new music with Long Beach Opera in the summer, right? And then she's got this like '80s pop song called "Control Z Your Life" with puppets. So you know, I mean, there's just no. I think if you, as Sarah was saying, you embrace that breadth of your creative interests, that creativity is creativity, and the more that you harness it in one area, the more it shows up in all the other parts of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great answers. I hope, Stephen, that answers your question. So I think it's about that time that we say goodbye. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, let's first all like give a hand, thank our panelists for showing up today, spreading all this wisdom about choral music and starting choral music and starting to write choral music. Yeah, so I just wanted to briefly, again, just plug in the chat. I have put down, if you are interested in learning more about the C. Creative Workshop or about C. Music Publishing, please feel free to subscribe to our newsletter. It's at cdoc.com. You just scroll all the way to the bottom and you can enter in your information and we'll start emailing you stuff. But also please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Other than that, we are hoping, I want to thank all of you for showing up today. This is our first panel ever. I hope it's been successful. I hope it's been elucidating for all of you. So yeah, I hope that we'll have future panels in the future. And again, thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to leave up the chat for just a couple more minutes, just in case you want to get our information. So yeah, thanks, everybody.